very much longer.
My Lords, I like this group of amendments. We've just had an earlier group of amendments in which we talked a lot about protecting species habitats. And as much as I'm an enthusiast of the hedgehog as anyone else, I'm actually worried that what this bill neglects is human species habitats, and that is housing. So I really am glad that we're going to focus in on that. I thought that we heard an imaginative, problem-solving amendment from the noble Lord Best, who brilliantly motivated homes for older citizens, something that I would like to see developed. And I've added my name to amendments 215 and 218, and I'm grateful to the noble Lords Lansley and Young of Cookham and Baroness Hayman of Ulloch for focusing on housing supply. I made that the focus of my second reading speech, and I've continued to raise the issue. But I think it's been explained and motivated so well so far that I'll confine myself to Amendment 2110 in my name, but to note that unless there's some movement from the government in terms of both tackling the blocks to building more homes and also increasifying, stultifying and sluggish slowing down of housing supply, then I'll happily support those noble lords and baronesses if they put in similar amendments at report stage, because I do think this is of great urgency. But I want to, for now, move Amendment 210, that is quite a modest amendment. It's about how homes are categorised and marketed in local plans. And it's about ensuring that any local plans are honest and transparent about data and targets when it comes to housing. Housing is usually categorised as either rented or owned, but I suggest that we need a third category that might more honestly reflect reality. If you go to an estate agent's or look longingly in the window, you either look at rented accommodation or for sale. But if you were lucky enough to buy a home, you would assume that you were buying it and it's all fully yours. But the sad reality is that for 1 in 4 of so-called homeowners, nearly 5 million homes are in this category, if you buy a home and it's a leasehold property, you aren't a homeowner at all. And people should know what that means. So when they go to the estate agent, we need to ensure that there is less mis-selling and that the estate agent advertises in their windows homes to lease rather than homes to sell when it comes to leaseholders. And this is important because a lot of the government's rhetoric in relation to housing and levelling up is to motivate the increase in the number of homeowners. And in those figures, arguably, leaseholders should not be counted. So just a few definitions and a bit of history. The reality is that the nature of leasehold really was rather a shock to many of us, and it was revealed and exposed by the post-Grenfell building safety crisis. And it's become more and more apparent to leaseholders, at least, that we are not homeowners. And I declare an interest as a leaseholder. Basically, we realised that when what we've purchased is a time-limited licence to occupy a concrete shell, of which the leaseholder doesn't own a brick, even after they've redeemed their mortgage. Often in contemporary debates on this issue, and there's been a lot recently in both houses, leasehold is described as feudal serfdom. And when I heard that, I thought it was just a bit of political hyperbole. But actually, leasehold tenure harks back to an age when land was correlated with power, and even leasehold in 2023 is indeed firmly still rooted in a sense of serfdom and manorialism. The medieval aristocracy enjoyed perpetual land ownership by allowing serfs to occupy premises on their land in return for labour, and then later in exchange for financial contributions. But as if to emphasise how much of that ancient history continued well after the end of feudalism, for many years leaseholders didn't have the franchise. Why? Because the property qualification required to have the vote, meant that you had to own your own property. And indeed, if you own your own property, that was only those people were allowed to choose who governed you. And because leaseholders didn't count as owning their own property, they were not given the vote. When, of course, the democratic struggles succeeded in abolishing this egregious property requirement for voting, there was no abolition of leasehold, unfortunately. But not for want of trying. Even in 1824, Lord Randolph Churchill decried leasehold for empowering landowners to, quote, exercise the most despotic power over every individual who resides in his property. And indeed, between 1884 and 1929, there were at least 18 attempts to legislate against leasehold. And it just seems ridiculous that this has been going on for so long. And here we are in 2023 with seeming cross-party unanimity at last about abolishing leasehold altogether. So Lisa Nandy, Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, has made Labour's position clear that they will abolish leasehold, and on this at least agrees with the Housing Secretary Michael Gove and many crossbenchers and bishops and Liberal Democrats and everybody in this House who seemed to have been passionate and vociferous on the issue. So you might think then, why am I going on? Maybe this amendment is totally redundant. But until I see it in the King's speech, I remain sceptical. Or at least I want to ensure that we are honest before then about what leasehold means. When this bill aims to increase home ownership and says that home ownership is an important part of levelling up, then I want to ensure that leasehold properties should not be counted under this category of home ownership. I'd like to welcome a new grassroots campaign organisation at this stage, Common Hold Now, set up by the tireless leaseholder activists Harry Scoffin and Carolina Zoltanica, which is calling for a mass shift to Common Hold, a system, by the way, widely used in Scotland, in Canada, and Australia. But the organisation I thought was interesting and related to this is committed to what it calls real home ownership. And its focus on what makes ownership real is autonomy and control. And people indeed aspire to buy properties precisely so that they can have greater freedom, autonomy and control. And they feel as though that will be different than being dependent on a landlord as renters. So it's very disillusioning then to discover that leasehold actually robs you of that control. I learnt that the hard way shortly after I became a first-time buyer over 20 years ago, partly to fulfil my father's rather forlorn deathbed request that I settle down and take some responsibility. Some local footballing kids cracked my new flat's window, so I decided to take my father's advice, acted responsibly and replaced the window. The response of my freeholder, Haringey Council, was to fine me for interfering in their property without permission. My father, who worked in the construction business, also warned me that I should always get lots of comparative quotes from a range of contractors before getting any work done. But as a local authority leaseholder, I have no right to do that. It's the council who enter into long-term agreements with contractors and who do not even have to tender for each project. And those of us who have to pay for the works have no right to decide on the scope, timing or even necessity of any of those works. So being a leaseholder makes it almost impossible to budget, as you have no control or even can't find out the extent of forthcoming costs because you don't control spending. For private sector leaseholders in the midst of the energy crisis, it's even worse, and one article was entitled, "I'm writing the cheque, yet I have no control over what is being spent." And even legislation designed in this House to protect leaseholders by making homes safer has been used and turned into yet another mechanism for extracting cash and diminishing choice and autonomy from many private leaseholders. One shocking example, in light of fire safety legislation that we passed here, was that a block of leaseholders were told they'd be collectively charged £500,000 to replace wooden terraces with special composite materials. These leaseholders, at their own expense, consulted independent experts who told them the terraces did not need replacing. They were not a fire risk or in breach of any new legislation. And anyway, paving stones were a lot cheaper and would do just as well. In other words, Being a leaseholder means you don't own your own home, and this bill needs to reflect that. To finish off, I of course don't want my amendment or any critique of leasehold to become an excuse for not building new homes, such as blocks of flats. As I've mentioned, the solution to the housing crisis, both rental and in terms of buying, and the solution to the affordability issue, is to focus on increasing supply and with urgency. But in a recent article in the Financial Times by John Byrne Murdoch, he made a plea for apartment living in high-density, high-rise blocks. And I'm all for that. But such developments are inevitably leasehold at the present time. And I feel that focusing new house building and urban development on blocks of leasehold flats could lead to creating more second-class homeowners locked in and trapped to a costly and miserable limbo of leasehold. And even indeed Lord Best's retirement accommodation, much of it is at the present leasehold, and there are problems of exorbitant service charges. So we need to make sure that those desperate to get their first foot on the first rung of the property ladder are not exploited by believing that leasehold means that they are now own and control their homes. At the very least, any new homes built that offer leasehold rather than shared freehold or common hold must be honestly reflected and labelled in government data. These should not be counted as home ownership or cited as proof of fulfilling levelling up targets. So until leasehold is abolished, let's call it for what it is, and it's not home ownership.
My Lords, I rise